Hi, thanks for joining us today for the talk with Jeff Pappas on New Mexico's segregated past, documenting Jim Crow in the National Register of Historic Places. For those of you who don't know, I'm Melanie McWhorter. I'm the development coordinator here at Historic Santa Fe Foundation. And Historic Santa Fe Foundation is a nonprofit member-based organization in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and located on Canyon Road. I'm here in the office currently, and you can find more about us on historicsantafe.org. We host talks on a monthly basis that are for members, but we do allow drop-ins for the talks. You can find out about our talks online. We have upcoming talks with Cormac O'Malley and Tom Leach on a book that they're doing at the press at the Palace of the Governors on the work of Cormac O'Malley's father, Ernie O'Malley, that Tom Leach has produced. The senior O'Malley was a driver and friend to Dorothy Stewart, whose sister Margareta Dietrich once owned this space, Zaguán, called Zaguán, where we're located on Canyon Road. On April 13th, Victor Yamada will speak about Japanese internment in New Mexico during World War II. On April 29th, Richard Miller will speak about his book on the Union General John Sal and on Sal's command of the Colorado Volunteers during the Civil War in New Mexico. So we have some exciting talks that are coming up. If you don't get our newsletters currently, you can sign up at historicsantafe.org and find out what we have scheduled. Many of you came into this talk without any audio and video. We will allow questions at the end of this talk with Jeff in the chat box. So if you'd like to post any questions, the chat box is open for everyone. Please kind of moderate what you put in there because everyone can see it. And then I'll read questions out to Jeff near the end, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we possibly can. When he starts to speak and he does screen sharing, you can minimize your screen. There should be a little button probably as you start to see, depending on your view. So there should be a way to minimize it if it doesn't do it automatically. And we are delighted to have Dr. Jeff Pappas with us today as the speaker. He delivered a talk a few years ago when we could actually do in-person events, pre-pandemic days, and our annual garden party and members meeting. And at that, he mentioned segregated schools in New Mexico that were new to the Register of Historic Places. So we were incredibly intrigued by this topic and thought it would be a great salon, especially for this month in particular. So Dr. Jeff Pappas holds degrees from Brigham Young University, Baylor University, and a PhD in American Indian and Environmental History from Arizona State University. Before joining the New Mexico SHPO, Pappas worked for National Park Service at Yosemite, splitting his year between California and Fort Collins, Colorado, where he taught in the history department at Colorado State University. He was appointed as State Historic Preservation Officer in 2012 and teaches part-time in the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of New Mexico. So if you would right now, we want to thank Jeff Pappas for his presentation today, and welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Melanie. I'll share the PowerPoint, and let's do that. Okay. Is that good? Okay, everyone, can you see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I shall begin. Well, Melanie, thank you. Thank you so much for having me talk about this very important topic of the African-American experience in New Mexico. It's something that the Historic Preservation Division has been looking at now fairly closely for about 6 or 7 years. And of course, the topic has been around for a very long time. And I'm going to introduce you to some key people that were involved in helping to bring this history to light way back, and bring you up to date as far as what the historic preservation is doing and why we're interested in this particular topic. But as you can see by the title of the topic itself, though, I really do want to talk about how the SHPO's office, the Preservation Division, captures the history of New Mexico, particularly through its responsibilities through the National Register of Historic Places, which my office manages at the state level on behalf of the National Park Service. And it's just a wonderful way for the SHPO's office to collect and to gather data and information on important topics, significant topics, and to use that data and information as a means to list significant properties, buildings and sites, historic districts, to the National Register of Historic Places and also to the State Register of Cultural Properties. But for the purposes of this talk, though, I think I'm going to stay fairly close to how we engage the National Register of Historic Places to collect information, particularly in this case for the African American experience in New Mexico. Okay. Let's put a name, at least a face, to the actual court decision. You all are probably fairly familiar with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 that created the separate but equal policy under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And so before I get to the National Register work that we're doing here, I'd like to give you a little bit of some history behind and some historical context behind the Jim Crow era, and then bring you into the New Mexico story. And I think the first thing that we ought to do, though, is to sort of review the Plessy case, which was rendered by the Supreme Court in 1896, the opinion of which was written by Justice Henry Billings Brown. And again, this really goes back to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which was passed during Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. And this is what he argued to create this separate notion, separate but equal, that we came to know during the Jim Crow era, which lasted from 1896 to roughly 1954. And this is really right, this quote here is from his decision, and it says this: "The object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But, interestingly enough, in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social, as distinguished from political equality, or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either." And so the culture of separate but equal was articulated by Justice Brown back in 1896, and for the next 60 or so years, this country would live under the precepts that was established during the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Now, here in New Mexico, it's not entirely true to say that the African American experience began with the Buffalo Soldiers, but significantly it did. Going back to 1866, just a year after the Civil War, in fact, the year in which the 14th Amendment was passed by the US Congress, we had an influx, in this case, of the famous Buffalo Soldier story begins in New Mexico here at Fort Selden, Fort Sumner, and Fort Stanton, to some degree Fort Craig, and a few other places throughout the American West, including New Mexico. But the first Buffalo Soldiers to serve in New Mexico arrived in 1866, when members of the 57th and 125th Infantry Regiments camped at Fort Sumner. If you're familiar with that facility here in New Mexico, well en route south to Fort Stanton and, of course, Fort Selden. Beginning in late 1875, the famed 9th Cavalry relocated their regimental headquarters to Fort Union to the north, New Mexico. Members of the 9th Cavalry deployed to Fort Baird in the southern part of Silver City, Fort Craigs and Cummings, McRae, Selden, Stanton, Tularosa, and Fort Wingate out toward the western part of the state. You can see some photographs here sort of celebrating these historic areas where the Buffalo Soldiers were stationed. The image in the middle there, of course, is of Fort Stanton down toward Lincoln County, which is now a state historic site under the Department of Cultural Affairs. And of course, that site is listed to both the state and to the National Register of Historic Places. And in that nomination, the story of the Buffalo Soldiers is told fairly well. To the bottom and to your left is what remains of historic Fort Craig, which of course you can get to just off of Highway 25, south of Socorro. The facility is owned and operated by the Bureau of Land Management, and it's interpreted in part for its Buffalo Soldier past. And of course, off to the right, we have Fort Selden, which is down toward Las Cruces, just north of Las Cruces, down near the Hatch area, just south of Hatch. And of course, that facility as well is managed as a state historic site by the Department of Cultural Affairs. And so we have a significant African-American story already beginning here in the state by 1866, roughly 30 years, in fact, before the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Now, outside, external to the military presence here in New Mexico, part of this civilian or part of the great migration of African Americans from the South through Texas and then spilling into parts of eastern New Mexico literally began as early as 1901. There was an understanding that many of the southern plantation or the southern sharecroppers that were experiencing some severe, I would say, of the Jim Crow laws in the American South began to migrate west during the Great Migration period, which really began between 1916 officially and ending in 1970. But prior to 1916, though, there was a smattering of African Americans that came through West Texas and into eastern New Mexico to try to escape the severe conditions of Jim Crow, and set up shop and created, or at least incorporated hometown, Blackdom, which is down toward, of course, the southern part of the state, where they became agriculturalists, many of which would work on the railroad. But they would settle this area, and of course that site is now, in this case, it's noted by the Blackton Town Site historic marker and other remnants that's in that area. But most historians would agree on one matter, that it was Frank Boyer, accompanied by a man named Daniel Keyes, who walked the 2,000 plus miles from Pelham, Georgia to the Roswell area, sometime in the period of 1899 to 1900, with the goal of starting an African-American town out west. And interestingly enough, if you note down below with the historic marker photograph, that's actually the descendants of the Boyer family celebrating the historic marker. And later, in fact, and I'll be talking about this, the listing of the Lawrence Dunbar Elementary School to the National Register of Historic Places. The Dunbar School in the town of Vado was a segregated school built in 1925. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the story of segregation in New Mexico, this is the text that actually comes out of the statute which established segregation in the state of New Mexico, which was actually first drafted in 1923 and then formalized in 1925 through this state statute. And I have the 1941 annotated version of it, because you can actually find that pretty easily if you look. And this is what it says. It says separate, this is supposed to set up this notion of segregation in New Mexico, separate schools for colored pupils, that pupils who are residents of a district shall be permitted to attend school in the same, regardless of the time when they acquired such residence, provided that where, in the opinion of the county, and that's important here in New Mexico, opinion of the county school or municipal school board, and on approval of said opinion by the State Board of Education, it is for the best advantage of the school that separate rooms be provided for the teaching of pupils of African descent. So dissimilar to some of the other Jim Crow laws or the segregation policies that came out of the American South, the New Mexico State Legislature, starting in 1923 with a conversation on how to segregate, ultimately gave the authorities to the counties to either create separate rooms for their African-American students or to build separate schools and separate facilities, much like that they were doing throughout other parts of the country. And in New Mexico, many of the counties that bordered Texas would in fact adopt a segregation policy and begin building segregated schools as early as 1925. Now, we do know as well that in Albuquerque, they actually did, in fact, many of the public schools in Albuquerque did in fact create separate rooms, which was a literal translation from the statute here, to accommodate for their African-American students. Now, what we don't know, and we've gone through the Office of African-American Affairs, and they've got I think, a really good understanding of the census going back to 1905 through the 1920s, that there were upwards to about 25,000 African Americans then living in the state of New Mexico, but I would have to confirm that again with the Office of African American Affairs. But at any rate, by 1925, though, we see the construction of segregated schools starting in Vado in the state of New Mexico. One of the first newspaper pieces, or first, I think maybe, I don't know if this is quite a newspaper piece, but through the journey of strategic studies, we began to look at what happened here in New Mexico by about the year 2004, though the work had been going on for quite some time. And I'll introduce you to some of the folks here in the state that had been thinking about this going back to the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. But this particular article here was one of the most comprehensive pieces that came out through our media that talked about the segregated history here in New Mexico. This particular piece is actually written by Gene Romo for the Journal of the Southern Bureau. And this piece was written to celebrate, or in case to mark, I would say, the 50th anniversary of the landmark Brown decision, which of course came out in 1954, which officially ended the Jim Crow, which started with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896. Now you can see here by the text, it's the 50th anniversary of the landmark Brown decision that ended decades of separate schooling for whites and blacks in the United States. Several New Mexico communities, mostly in the state's southeast, established segregated schools during the 1920s. And state law passed in 1923 and amended in 1925 would allow for municipal or county boards, like I'd mentioned, of education to establish segregated schools. Shortly after 1925, there were roughly 9 communities and counties here in the state of New Mexico that did segregate, and they were listed down below here to the left. And those would include schools or districts in Hobbs, in Las Cruces, in Roswell, in Artesia, in Carlsbad, Clovis, Tucumcari, Vado, and Alamogordo. So the segregated part of New Mexico, at least within the school districts, was largely located in the southeastern part of the state, and we remain there primarily, though, like I said, in Albuquerque, they did adopt separate rooms to accommodate for African American students. Now, here in New Mexico, to understand the African American experience prior to 2004, before that article was published, had been going on for quite some time. Most famously here, and Many of you may remember Clarence Fielder, who was very influential educator in the Las Cruces public school system, both within secondary education ranks and at New Mexico State University. And through the work that he had been doing with the Phillips Chapel Association, noted here in the photographs, began to put together the history of the African-American experience. And it really was Clarence who was the state's expert when it came to understanding the history of the Blacks here in New Mexico. And Clarence would go on to a distinguished career later as a professor at New Mexico State University, and he also served for several years on the state's Cultural Properties Review Committee, and it was within that capacity that Clarence began to talk about how we might be able to capture the African-American experience through the National Register program. And in 2003, while Clarence was serving on the Cultural Properties Review Committee, which is a gubernatorial appointed committee that works with the Historic Preservation Division to nominate properties to the National Register. Phillips Chapel, as you can see here, was listed to the National Register in 2003, and we believe that this was the first associated property or significant structure associated with Black New Mexico that was listed to the National Register. And this was 1 year, of course, prior to that published article that came out in 2004. Unfortunately, Clarence passed away a few years ago, but he just left an enduring legacy for the state. And there are others. By 1999, roughly 4 years before Clarence began his work nominating and listing properties to the National Register, the state of New Mexico established the Office of African American Affairs, first led by Kalanji here, the photograph to the left, who we worked with extensively to help identify and list a couple of properties to the National Register much later, just a few years ago. But it was really Kalanji and Clarence who began to pick up the torch and begin to actually document all the associated structures and buildings associated with the African American experience during the segregated period and beyond, too, through the 1960s and the 1970s. And it was Kalanji here who shared with us the list of all the African American churches that were still extant in the state up through 2017, with the hope that we might be able to do a little bit more research and nominate facilities and structures beyond schools that would include associated resources like churches and other kinds of facilities. Kalanji is still very active here in the state of New Mexico on behalf of the African American community. But you can see by the logo up top, the New Mexico Office of African American Affairs is a cabinet level office, and it is supported by the New Mexico state government, and they work within the African American communities daily on all kinds of issues, not just history, but health related issues, anything related to the African American experience here in New Mexico. And have been also instrumental in helping us to identify some key significant structures and buildings associated with their community. And they estimate right now that there's probably about between 60 to 65,000 African Americans now living in the state of New Mexico. Now, beyond Kalanji, of course, is Rita Paudrell. If you know Rita's work and are familiar with the African American Museum and Cultural Center, she's a peer. She's been working with Kalanji and other members of the community. She was a good friend with Clarence and others. And of course, she's the one who founded the Museum and Cultural Center. She was also a recipient of a 2012 Cultural Properties Review Committee Heritage Preservation Award. At the time, Clarence had moved off the CPRC, but the CPRC then sitting decided to award Rita for the work that she had been doing within the African American community, particularly within the performing arts and other kinds of art venues. And if you're not familiar with her facility in Albuquerque, I highly recommend it. It's just a wonderful place to visit once we can go out there and visit again after hopefully COVID runs its course through the summer and into the fall. But her mission of the African American Museum and Cultural Center of New Mexico is to increase awareness and understanding of the contributions of people of African descent with emphasis on New Mexico and the Southwest. The museum will be a vehicle for the perpetual definition of our history. So along with the Office of African American Affairs, independent scholars like Clarence Fielder, and of course people like Kalanji, and other nonprofit institutions, there are many people out there that have dedicated their entire lives to helping to collect and to archive the African American experience in New Mexico, including Rita. And within the last 10 or 15 years, as a result of their excellent work moving forward, and this really creates the foundation for much of the work that we're doing now at the state level, at the Historic Preservation Division. Interpretive exhibits like this that were put up as part of the Clarence Fielder Collection and Archives down in Las Cruces. These were put up at the Phillips Chapel for folks to enjoy and to better understand the relationship of the African American experience to the southern part of the state. There's just been some wonderful interpretation that's been going on between Las Cruces and Albuquerque to bring this story to popular audiences. And so we're really beginning to create a meaningful special collection and archive to capture the African American experience, particularly from the Buffalo Soldiers onward. And part of this, of course, is our segregated, or at least the segregated part of New Mexico. And what we're doing at the Historic Preservation Division is try to capture that through the extant schools that were built during segregation. But there's plenty of wonderful information out there. If you're at all interested in this history, you can certainly reach out to Las Cruces and other special collections across the state that are collecting important information about Blacks in New Mexico. Now, all of this work prior to the Historic Preservation Division getting actively involved in identifying African American associated resources like you see here, these two churches here that are part of the African American experience. We had heard about segregation as early as 2015, 2016, when we were investigating the possibility of nominating churches to the National Register. But we didn't really have a good sense as to the segregated history of our state. And so we began to think about it, to do a little bit of research, and we were fortunate at that particular time to hire a very good intern, Jacob Connerly, who's a resident here. He's from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and you may even know his father. I believe he's a chiropractor here in town. Jacob is just one of these wonderful students who came to us as an undergraduate from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, who had a very deep interest in African American history. And we were looking for someone to help us do a little bit more research and to figure out what this segregated past, what it means and how we as a division might be able to participate in collecting information about African Americans in New Mexico. And suffice to say, I'm not going to go through all the work that Jacob had done for us that summer, but it was absolutely extensive. And that information is all available at the Historic Preservation Division for anyone to take a look at. But primarily, though, what Jacob did for us, though, was to take us through the history of segregation from the statute going back to 1923 through 1925, and then systematically working with people like Kalanji in particular to identify all the extant schools. We were at this point, we were started to get interested in education, and particularly in the schools after we realized that some of the schools were built after 1925, and we wanted to locate those and hopefully talk to these communities to figure out ways that we might be able to celebrate them through nominating them to the National Register. Jacob just did this wonderful job for us, collecting all of this information so that we could move forward by 2016 and 2017 in opening up conversations with those communities that were noted, including Clovis in particular, Vado, Tucumcari, and a few others. So it was really the work that Jacob had did that kind of opened up our eyes to the possibility of what we might be able to do with this history. Now, also, too, we were looking at the scholarship here in the state of New Mexico to help augment our understanding of African Americans in New Mexico. And fortunately, going back to about 2013, again, this is relatively new work, a professor, a gentleman named Bruce Glassrod here, who had been teaching at California State University, East Bay, had made a career out of thinking about and writing and publishing on the African American experience in the state of Texas. And through his extensive research, he also moved into parts of eastern New Mexico, and by 2013 had enough edited information to put together this wonderful collection of essays that came out in 2013 called The African American History in New Mexico, Portraits from 500 Years. And it really is a wonderful book if you'd like to know a little bit more detail about the full experience of African Americans in New Mexico up through about the year, I think he goes up to about the year 2000. And so this book became also pivotal for us as we began to think about how we might be able to capture the historical context of African Americans here. And we were fortunate enough to contact Dr. Glassrod and conduct several interviews with him and to capture his experiences that he had here in the state doing this history. Now, there are other people here as well, important people that are working on this story. And we're fortunate too to have another well-known scholar working in this field, capturing this history that would help us again to better understand what we might be able to do with this story. And currently, Dr. Jefferson at the University of New Mexico is currently teaching on the African American experience in the American Southwest. He just does a wonderful job. He's written several books on the topic, and here's a few of his books here. And he's very interested in the military side of the story, which of course is very important to the state of New Mexico. Our military past is very, very important to our history, particularly in the 20th century. And Dr. Jefferson has just done a wonderful job helping us to understand that part of the story. Perhaps one day we're going to take this and think about how we might be able to involve veterans in some further studies to better understand Blacks here in the state. But he's very accessible, and he's a very nice man, and I would recommend that you give him a call if you're interested in this history. Now, with all of this data that we now have, and we've been thinking and collecting, talking to people, reading, learning ourselves. By about the year 2017 or so, just 4 years ago, just after Jacob had finished up his work, as a staff, we really understood that we had something special here, that uncovering the story of New Mexico's segregated past, particularly through its educational systems and its schools. By the year 2016, late in 2016, after Jacob had completed his work, we knew that there were probably upwards to 7 extant schools that were still on the landscape, that were still being used by local school districts that were built during segregation, specifically for segregation. And again, that goes back to 1925 and as recently as 1965. And I'll talk about that, even though that's about 11 years after the end of Jim Crow. There were still some communities in New Mexico that did practice segregation up through 1965 and began to continue to add to their campuses to accommodate for their African American students. And so we thought, how can we then engage our role, or our legal responsibility to collect data for the state of New Mexico and to nominate these properties that are still extant to the National Register for the purposes of getting this story out, at least to understand the story better than what we know, and to really give the public a sense as to what the story is all about. So the best vehicle for us, and it's a wonderful vehicle for us, is through the National Register of Historic Places. And so this is what it says. This is the National Register of Historic Places. Is the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation. I'm sure all of you have seen buildings that have the plaques on them. The one that's noted up there at the top of the slide. It was authorized. The program was authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. It's the National Park Service's Register of Historic Places as part of a national program to coordinate and support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect America's historic and archaeological resources. And the photographs that I've actually included here are not of the schools, but these are some recent properties that just last year and into this year we have nominated to the National Register. And you're probably familiar with all of them. To the upper left-hand corner is Georgia O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch facility. We worked with the O'Keeffe Museum to nominate the Ghost Ranch property. Of course, the Abiquiu property that she had lived in after Ghost Ranch was listed on the National Register many years ago, but the O'Keeffe Museum was interested in also getting the Ghost Ranch property on the National Register, which we did just this year. To the upper right is the Downtowner Motel. This is the way that it appeared in the 1960s, but this is just on Central Avenue in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There's about 9th and Central. There's a private developer interested in redeveloping the property, and for the purposes of being eligible for federal tax credits to rehabilitate the property, we just listed it to the National Register of Historic Places. And down below is the Hindi store. If you're familiar with the town of Durand, we just listed the entire town, in fact, to the National Register of Historic Places as a full district. And we're really proud of that, and we work very closely with the community members of Durand to make that possible. Now, the first school that was constructed, and you can see it here in the upper right-hand corner, it's kind of a nondescript facility or property architecturally. I would say that it is a darling of the state, but of course it's very, very important purpose. The Paul Laurence Dunbar School, we were notified as we began to think about the African-American experience and we began to put out feelers within these segregated communities. The folks, in fact, the community of Vado, New Mexico came forth and spoke to us about their Paul Laurence Dunbar School. And this was the first school that we identified as being part of the segregated experience here in New Mexico, and working with community leaders in Vado. In fact, they have an alumni association that is part of the segregated school. And in fact, Mrs. Bobby Boyer, just below here on the left slide, of course, is the ancestor of the Boyer family that came into New Mexico in 1901. So she was just absolutely thrilled that we were willing to take this up, and we really were. By the time Jacob had been through with his work in the summer of 2016, we put together a nomination and we submitted it to the Cultural Properties Review Committee for consideration. Of course, they wholeheartedly supported this nomination. But what you're looking at here, though, is the first school that was constructed in New Mexico to accommodate for our African-American students during our segregated period. And so it is a very significant building here in the state. And it was listed to the state and national register in 2016. And if you are interested, we have all of these nominations are available for public consumption. You can certainly call me or email me, and all of you can get copies of the nomination. It's just a wonderful story and history of what we've been talking about today, captured in it's just this beautiful nomination that talks about this community of Vado, New Mexico. And they had this wonderful ceremony. They came to Santa Fe as a community. to hear the CPRC meeting when they nominated it to the state register, ultimately to the national register. And it was just this wonderful event that we had with the community leaders of Vado to celebrate this past, the story of their school. Now, shortly after that, we were then, through word of mouth, in fact, in the spring or late winter, early spring of 2017, we had posted the Dunbar School to our Facebook account. We had written a press release about this listing and how important it was to the state. We were very proud of it, and the folks in Vado were. And the folks in Vado were very friendly with other communities in the southeastern part of the state that had a similar historical experience. And so the next school that we were introduced to was a very important facility, and this is the Lincoln Jackson School in Clovis, New Mexico. And here are contemporary photographs of the Lincoln Jackson School here, to the upper photograph, the lower one here, and of course Ida Jackson to the left, which is it's named after, a very important person here in the state. And so we began to work with their alumni association, and they actually have a very large alumni association associated with the Lincoln Jackson School in Clovis that have kept the memory of this particular experience alive and well in that community. And working through their alumni association, we then went ahead and drafted a second National Register nomination to talk about the history of the Lincoln Jackson School. And this one is rather interesting. As you can see, it was constructed between 1952, very late during the segregated period. And of course, it continued through 1965, which is quite telling. By 1954, after the Brown decision was rendered, most of the segregated communities in New Mexico integrated, except for, I believe, Clovis, and there was another, maybe Artesia, but I'll have to check on that. But Clovis continued the practice through 1965, and in fact, the campus of the Lincoln Jackson School was added on to as late as 1962. But by 1965, Clovis did integrate, and the Lincoln Jackson School was repurposed into the public school system. But this is just another wonderful nomination that we've been working on here that had been listed to the National Register that tells this terrific story of the Lincoln Jackson School and about the community in Clovis that supported this nomination. Now, where do we go from here? We know that there's probably 5 other schools out there that were built during segregation through Jacob's research. And we're going to continue to work. We've been talking to community leaders in Artesia and in Tucumcari. We haven't gotten to the nomination stage yet, but we're working through that with those communities, hoping that perhaps within the next 2 to 3 years, we might have 2 additional nominations, which I think would make 4 now, out of possible 7 extant buildings associated with the segregated period, but we're not quite there yet with these other communities. But in the meantime, though, we became incredibly interested, not just in segregation and education, but as a state and as a state historic preservation office, we became interested in trying to understand the extent of all the facilities, buildings and structures, districts and what have you, associated with the 20th century African-American experience for the purposes of understanding the history, of course, but more importantly, to nominate a broader range of historic facilities to the National Register. Now, the way that we do that is through this process here on this particular slide. And just so they don't get too bureaucratic on you and too government speak, where we capture and how we capture larger contextual themes associated with with particular histories here in New Mexico is through this document here, which is again is a National Park Service document. It's called a Multiple Property Documentation Form. And as you can see to the right in the text, the purposes of this form, and we use these contexts all the time so that we can go about identifying historic buildings to be nominated to the National Register. And as you can see, it says the evaluation properties for the National Register eligibility involves an assessment of the significance of a property in terms of the history of the relevant geographic area, the history of associated historical themes or subjects, which what we're interested in here, and within an historical and contemporary time frame. In other words, its context. And what this does is sort of broadens out the African American experience for us. And as we begin to look at the whole history, we can identify associated structures and buildings that's part of a much more contextual analysis than just schools. We're going to be looking at churches. We're going to be looking at pool halls. We're going to be looking at other kinds of associated buildings that's important to the African American experience. So after the 2017 listing of the Lincoln Jackson School, in 2018, we decided to fund a full multiple property documentation form, a full historic context on the African American experience in the 20th century New Mexico to help us identify this much broader grouping of buildings and structures to be nominated to the National Register. In fact, we'll be getting a draft of that history probably within the next 3 to 4 months. And so we've gone through the contracting period in 2019. We did an RFP process in early 2020 and ultimately chose a contractor to work with us. And again, that draft is coming out probably in September of 2021. And then we will use that document and to help identify other buildings to be listed to the register. And in fact, yeah, this slide here tells a little bit about that. We hired a wonderful historian named Jean Fulton out of Silver City. She's the contractor for this. And the name of this new context here is called the African American Experience in 20th Century New Mexico. We're really excited about this. So the purpose, of course, is so that we can continue to build the history of this particular theme through other associated resources. And these are what you see here. They're just a wonderful collection of images that came out of the History Museum here in Santa Fe. And these are all part of that early 20th century of the African American experience in the southern part of the state. And so you've got the churches, of course, you have the stores themselves, the mercantiles, the gas stations, and other farming and agricultural facilities that we'd like to identify through Jean's work so that we can start talking to these communities or even identify these buildings are still there, and then begin to do even more National Register work so that we can fill out this history far beyond just segregation and the schools. And so where we are right now as a division is at the stage. We've got 2 nominations that have gone to the National Register to 7 schools that we know of. And now we're going to be looking in the fall and into spring next year, we're going to be looking at other associated resources to continue the story and to hopefully continue to build this narrative moving forward. So I'm very proud of this. And of course, this being Black History Month and a story in New Mexico that's not particularly well known. I think that through the next 3 to 5 years of good research and good scholarship, we might be able to understand this story a little bit better than what we know now. So with that, I'd like to conclude it. And of course, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them for you. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks to the Historic Santa Fe Foundation for asking me to do this, and to Pete Warzel and to his staff and to the board. So thanks for taking an interest in this particular topic. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. That was fantastic. If anyone has questions too, I did announce it in the beginning. If you want to put questions in the chat box or in the chat box, you can see the screen down at the bottom. And Jeff, you had mentioned if people could contact you as well. And I'll tell everyone that we did have your contact info on the Salon page and it's still at the very top. I also can put any links that you want me to add, including a link to your website too, or if there's specific links to your site relating to this information, maybe you and I can share that, and then we'll post it up there too. And I think we have one question, and if not, I have a couple that I kind of scribbled down as taking notes. But let's see. Someone asks, Stephen Klein says, are there any African American resources on Route 66?
Great question, Stephen. I don't know. And I think that we're going to be waiting for Jean's study to come out. I know that she's looking at Route 66. I know that there's probably something out toward the Santa Rosa area, but I am not sure if anything remains. But that's something, come back to me with this in another 6 months or so when we have Jean's study, and we might be able to answer the question.
All right, so any other questions right now? But I will, do you know if there's a lot of resources on the online resources, the Rocky Mountain Online Archives and New Mexico Digital Archives?
Yeah, Rocky Mountain Online is a good resource. I don't know if there's anything there. We didn't look at that. I think Jean probably is. So I don't know if there is or not. And I'm not even quite sure if there's any real special collections at the University of New Mexico right now. Maybe that's something for Professor Jefferson to answer. If you'd like to get in touch with him. There's not, other than the special collection in the archives in Las Cruces that Clarence had put together for the museum system, I don't know of any other special collections particularly on. But then again, the staff at the Office of African American Affairs too would probably know that.
Okay, all right, maybe we can put a link to their site too.
Yeah, that would be great. I'll appreciate that, yeah.
African American Affairs, I'll write myself a note. Oh, I had a question too about some of the schools, because you mentioned, especially the one in Clovis that was built much later,
Yes.
And you mentioned Albuquerque where there were separate rooms for some of the students. Did that occur throughout most of the state, or was there just not a population of African Americans, or did they integrate, or what was the status of a lot of those?
I suspect the answer to that is maybe a bit more sensitive than what this forum should get. I think that the communities that decide to build separate schools probably had very different relationships to their African American students than Albuquerque did. That was a decision at the school board level in Albuquerque to do that. It could have been as simple as they just didn't have the resources to build separate schools, or they didn't feel it was necessary, or they could accommodate for segregation within the schools themselves by offering up special rooms. That's the kind of research, though, that hasn't been done, right? We don't know. If we go back and look at, let's say, school board meetings or minutes to these meetings back in the 1930s and maybe 1930s and 1940s to understand better what they were up to, that's the kind of research that we haven't done yet. And that's something that I hope Jean's study or other future studies will do.
Okay, and then what about Santa Fe? Do you have any information on what was happening in Santa Fe at the time?
Not much. No, there wasn't a lot going on here in Santa Fe.
Oh, okay. And I think let's see. I think I might be done with some of my questions. I don't know if we have any other questions of attendees or not. You gave an incredibly thorough presentation. So I think Oliver Horn might have something. Oliver, if you just posted in the chat box. He says, it's very interesting that the state passed segregation laws at the very same time that much of the community was rallying against the Bursum bill.
Oliver, wow.
And then he follows up, is there any evidence that artists and intellectuals opposed segregation? Please tell us about the Bursum bill. I'm not familiar.
I'm not either. Oliver, you can probably educate us on that one.
Yeah, I know.
But it is coincident. I don't think it's a coincidence. Yeah, good one. I don't know. We can probably talk offline on that one so we can get a better handle on what your thinking is about
Maybe
that.
that's another talk.
No.
All right, okay, so Robin Powell asked, has Jean Fulton located students that attended any of the segregated schools for interviews?
Yes, we have. Yeah, and Jean didn't. In fact, the Alumni Association in Clovis has some members of their Alumni Association are old enough to actually had gone to the Clovis, to the Lincoln Jackson School when it was segregated. So we do have some living folks that went through this.
Okay, well, we're kind of like starting a little conversation kind of here though, but Oliver just updated and said it's against stealing Pueblo land.
Oh, repeat, Oliver, explain that. What, let me see here. Evidence that, and it was against stealing Pueblo land. I'm going to have to maybe call you on this one.
Yeah, we might have to
Talk
extend
about
that because that might be more of a discussion for this one talk.
Yeah.
Robin may have had a little follow up here, so we'll wait just 1 second to see if Robin comes in with that. And then if anyone else has any questions too. Now we're going to wrap up in just a couple minutes. Robin says, I saw on Clarence Fielder's obituary page a note about the first African-American graduate at NMSU, a woman. Her story would be interesting.
I agree, Robin. Maybe that's something that Jean has looked at. So, but I will, I'll tell Jean that to take a look at Clarence's obituary for sure. So thanks for that resource.
And we have a talk too on the occasion a few days before Juneteenth with someone who Jean actually through Jeff and through Jean recommended, a woman named Bobby Green. So she would actually speak a little bit about that too. I believe she teaches at NMSU. That's correct. So she'll be speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So everyone's here on June 17th, and we will be advertising that too. So she may know a good bit about this. She's the head of I believe it's Danya Anna NAACP. Is that correct?
It could be.
I can't remember what county she's with, but I should know that right now. So she'll have to forgive me for not recalling at this point. But if everyone mark your calendars or make sure you sign up, because that'll be kind of a secondary lecture that we'll have on the African American experience in New Mexico. So if we have no more questions, I think we're gonna start wrapping it up. And we thank you so much, Jeff. If anyone has any follow-up questions, you're welcome to contact Jeff by calling him or emailing him. And then on the Salon page of historicsantafe.org, we will have this information up there for a while, or they can contact you through, what's the website? What's your website, Jeff?
Yeah, just the New Mexico Historic Preservation Division. And you can just Google that and it'll take you right to it.
Cut off a little bit. Say that one more time.
I'm sorry, just the New Mexico Historic Preservation Division.
Okay, all right,
Still cut out there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've got it there, and I'll put a link to on the Salon page too. So thanks everyone for attending. Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Hope to see you soon.
Take care.
All right, take care, everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.